Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters here on France 24. Coming up in this edition, Benjamin Netanyahu gives in to a Supreme Court ruling and fires a senior member of his cabinet. But tensions are still on the rise between the Israel PM's new hard-right government and the courts, with thousands of protesters saying that democracy is under threat. Concern is growing for 7 French nationals being held captive in Iran. Among them is the French-Iranian academic Fariba Adelkhah, who has been in custody since 2019. In just a moment, we'll speak to her colleague to hear about how she's doing and what's being done to secure her release. Also coming up in the program, in many parts of the world, women serve as leaders in the Christian church, but that's not the case in the Holy Land. At least it wasn't until this week. We'll introduce you to the first woman ordained as a pastor of a Lutheran church in Jerusalem's Old City. We begin this edition in Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu bowed to pressure this week, firing a senior minister who was convicted of tax fraud. In doing so, Netanyahu complied with a Supreme Court ruling and avoided an immediate showdown with the judiciary. But the clash between the Israeli government and the courts is far from over, as Michael Matlin-Jones explains.
At a meeting of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet on Sunday, a chair sat empty. It would normally be occupied by Israel's Interior and Health Minister Ari Deri, who was removed from office by the Prime Minister. According to an official statement, he gave the news to Deri in a cabinet meeting. It's the first big setback for Benjamin Netanyahu since his return to power a month ago. The dismissal of his Health and Interior Minister came after the Israeli Supreme Court ruled he could not serve in his post due to a conviction for tax evasion. In 2022, Ari Deri announced his withdrawal from political life in order to avoid prison for his conviction before returning last November. For the opposition, his removal shows the fault lines in the far-right coalition government.
This is not a government, it's a circus. Netanyahu is weak, but he must appoint a new full-time health and interior minister today.
Opposition leader Yair Lapid took to the streets alongside thousands of demonstrators on Saturday. All are protesting against the government's plan to reform the judiciary, which would give more power to politicians. In particular, it wants to give Parliament the ability to overturn decisions by the Supreme Court, something that to many Israelis is a threat to democracy.
Well, concern is growing for 7 French nationals being held captive in Iran. Among them is Fariba Adelkhah, a researcher at Sciences Po here in Paris. She was arrested back in June of 2019, along with her colleague, Roland Marchal. Marchal was released in 2020, but with political tensions on the rise in Iran, she remains in jail. For more on this, we're joined by Sandrine Perrot, who is a researcher at Sciences Po and a member of a group dedicated to securing the release of Fariba Adelkhah. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. First of all, what do we know about how your colleague is being treated and what condition is she in?
Well, we don't know much, unfortunately, but as far as we know, she's doing relatively well. Of course, the time seems very long. The prison is totally overcrowded, and she shares her cell with 60 other persons, so it's really very difficult. But she's still very strong morally and very combative. And recently, in the last few days, she signed a letter with 30 other prisoners in Evin, to demand an end to the execution of protesters and to an end to unfair sentences. So she's still fighting for human rights. But the situation, of course, is really in Iran and in Evin is still very tense and difficult for her.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about that. First of all, I want to ask you, do you think enough is being done to secure the release of your colleague? And are you satisfied with efforts being made by the French government?
Well, the French diplomacy claims to be very committed, and we are grateful to the government for this. But one observation must be made from 2 French hostages taken in June 2019. There are now 7, at least, since we may not know all of them, and the French are not the only ones. On our side, we are a bit puzzled by the fact that sometimes the question of these hostages, and especially the French hostages, is not even mentioned in front of journalists when our President Emmanuel Macron talks about Iran. So we would expect a bigger publicization of these arbitrary detentions. We know that there are big issues to discuss these days with Iran, but we don't want our hostages to be forgotten in the negotiations because there are big issues too.
Well, now the EU has decided to sanction a number of Iranian officials and entities in response to a crackdown on protests. How concerned are you that that might complicate negotiations to secure the release of your colleague?
Well, you know, all these international tensions, of course, brings more complexity to the negotiation that can be discussed with Iran. At the same time, we don't know exactly, we don't know much about this policy of hostage taking. It could be related to the protest movements in Iran, to the factional struggles in Iran, and also to the French political position. So that's a very complex situation. And of course, it brings more attention for our hostages, for sure.
You touched on this already, but Fariba Adelkhah is not alone. There are other dual nationals, foreign nationals being held in Iran on false or trumped-up charges. What can you tell us about the wider picture here?
Well, you know, that's a very complex situation. That's a game that the Iranian government has played to enter in negotiations with other states for we have very different situations and very different games played by the Iranian government. But this is really why we ask now for the unconditional and immediate release of our prisoners. This is why also we will have a big rally on the 28th of January. So this Saturday in Paris on Place du Trocadéro, to ask also for a firmer stance by the European Union on this kind of practice. So the European Union has to recall the principles that must prevail between states and to denounce these hostage takings. And for us to remain silent in front of this hostage taking policy is also a signal to other states who are willing to act in the same way.
Okay, we want to thank you, Sandrine Perrot, who is a researcher at Sciences Po and member of a group dedicated to securing the release of Fariba Adelkhah. Thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. Next to Lebanon and the stalled investigation into the Beirut port explosion that killed some 200 people more than 2 years ago. This week, a judge announced he was reopening the probe, but has already faced pushback from the country's top prosecutor. In the meantime, families of the victims are calling for an international investigation into the tragedy. They say it's the only way to get justice, and they blame government corruption for the blast. Our correspondents Roland Marchal and Serge Berberi have the story.
William Noon is surrounded by his loved ones. Portraits of his brother, a firefighter who died in the Beirut port explosion, can be found in every corner of his family house. On January 13th, Noon was arrested for threatening to blow up the National Courthouse. He says it was a cry for help after the blast investigation was suspended for more than a year due to political pressure.
I was taken to a cell around 3 a.m. It was then that my lawyer told me that a violent fight had broken out in Byblos and that my uncle had been beaten in the head. I was worried because when the army and the security forces decide to intervene, they beat everyone up.
Near the family home is a shrine in memory of Joe Noon. Every day, William comes to meditate and pray for his brother.
They are intimidating us to stop calling for justice. International support is necessary because the politicians targeted by the investigation will do everything to short-circuit it.
This morning, William is taking part in a sit-in in downtown Beirut organized by victims' families. The protesters point to the culture of impunity in Lebanon. Faced with growing influence of politicians on the courts, Amnesty International is calling for the adoption of a draft law on judiciary independence.
One of the main problems with the judiciary in Lebanon is the system for the appointment of judges. The executive or the government has such an outsized role in picking judges to certain courts.
Former Justice Minister Ibrahim Najjar also denounces the lack of fairness and authorities' attempt to delay the investigation.
on a créé des officines.
They have their people in the judiciary. Some are compromised by political power. And it's time for all of this to end. I agree that some judges do not listen to their conscience as judges.
Ne sont pas à l'écoute de leur conscience de magistrats.
On August 4, 2020, more than 200 people died, 6,500 were injured, and an entire section of the capital was destroyed. For the moment, those in power refused to open an international investigation into the port explosion.
Well, in many parts of the world, women serve as leaders in the Christian church, but that's not the case in the Holy Land. At least it wasn't until this week. A Palestinian woman from Jerusalem has just been ordained as a pastor of a Lutheran church in the Old City. Charlie James has the story.
Worshippers from around the world came to Jerusalem's Old City to witness history. Hundreds looked on Sunday as a Lutheran church ordained the first Palestinian female pastor in the Holy Land. Sally Azar will now lead the English-speaking congregation at the Church of the Redeemer.
I never thought about becoming the first female pastor, to be honest. I hope through this day, through this ordination, many women are inspired by it to finally say, now we can finally study theology if you didn't dare, or whatever reason.
A Palestinian from Jerusalem, Azar is now one of just 5 ordained women in the Middle East, joining 1 in Syria and 3 in Lebanon. Most Palestinian Christians belong to denominations that do not allow female clergy. However, Azar is part of a small minority of Protestant congregations that ordain women ministers.
We were for so long outed of the church and forbidden to actually praise the Lord same as a man. So not just for our church is important. It's important for Palestine because it's an Arabic Palestinian woman who's becoming big.
Azar may be a trailblazer, but she says there is still much work to be done when it comes to equality in the church, even in those that already ordain women.
And that does it for this edition of Middle East Matters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.